Throughout church history, there have been several times where words or terms or phrases have seemingly arisen out of nowhere and begun to be misused and misapplied. Oftentimes, we end up looking back at those points in time and wondering how these words got to be so misused and misapplied. Our day and age is no different, and there is currently a term that I believe is being misused and misapplied, and it is hurting the church. Stay tuned, and we'll talk about it. Well, good evening and welcome back to another week of Explained, another week where we engage the culture from a biblical perspective in a manner which glorifies God. My name is Troy and I am your host. Thank you so much for joining us and taking some time out of your Thursday night to come and hang out with us. I really appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about this and observing it. We're going to be talking about what I believe is the single most misused, currently, the most misused term in the church in the West today. And what is that term? That term is political idolatry. Political idolatry. I believe that political idolatry is the single most misused term in the church in America today. Okay? Let's talk about why. I'll be taking the position, and I do take the position, that oftentimes when people accuse someone of political idolatry, that person is not actually guilty. It's a false accusation. Now, maybe the person who's accusing the other person of political idolatry just doesn't understand what political idolatry is. I think that often happens. Or maybe that person wants the other person to just be quiet, and they do understand what political idolatry really is, but they don't care. Whatever the reason is, and I think probably most of the time, you want to be charitable and show grace and mercy as a Christian. So I think most of the time it's probably the first type, and probably 5% of it is the second situation. But I think most of the time it's the first situation. It's just, I think people don't understand what the Bible would say political idolatry really is. And I think it just, political idolatry, the term just rose up so fast, and everybody kind of looked at it and they grabbed it. They said, I want that term. And then they just started slapping it on everything that they saw. All right, now, why am I saying that political idolatry is being misused? Because political idolatry is oftentimes used as an excuse to retreat from an area of the world where I believe Christians should be, and where the Bible would say that Christians and the Word of God should be, and that's politics. Christians should not retreat from that sphere, and oftentimes when Christians look at it and they're like, well, I don't want to commit political idolatry, it scares them away from getting involved in that sphere to the glory of God. And that's tragic, and it's not good. Political idolatry, the phrase political idolatry, when it's misused and misapplied, is dangerous for Christians, because then we're constantly boxing ourselves out of moral issues, which happen to be cloaked in politics. Okay, and I'm sure you can think of plenty of those different moral issues right now. As political, the political temperature has been turned up. Over the past, I would say again, probably over the past 10 years, the political left has become more and more radical and open with their beliefs about certain things, like the LGBTQ thing, or the pro-choice thing. Like those are issues that they're moral issues. But because they're cloaked in politics, because they're cloaked and covered in the blanket of politics, some Christians get afraid to get involved in stuff like that because they don't want to commit political idolatry. And that's not the right way to look at it. So let's define political idolatry. Like I said, we want to define it narrowly. so that it's effective when we actually have to use it. Because another thing I'm not saying is, does political idolatry actually exist? Yeah, political idolatry does exist, but it just doesn't exist nearly as much as people think it does. It probably exists about, I don't know, maybe 1% of the cases of people getting accused of political idolatry. I would say that person actually is committing political idolatry. And so let that be said. I'm not saying that political idolatry doesn't exist. I'm just saying that if you overuse the term, it's not going to be there when you need it. All right. It's going to be, you're going to beat it into the ground. And so then when you actually need it, it's not going to be there. A definition of political idolatry, I would say this. We want to make sure we narrowly define it. It's simply when you make politics God. When you make politics God. What is idolatry? If we just kind of zoom out and think about what is idolatry, that's when you make something else God. That is very clearly defined in the Bible. You look at the Old Testament, the prophets that are calling out people for idolatry. What are they doing? They're literally making a stump into their God. Okay? So we want to make sure we define idolatry correctly. That's idolatry, when you make something God. That doesn't have to be a rock or a stump or a cow that you make God. It could be like a career or something like that. Like those things are on the table as well. It doesn't have to be like a physical thing that you make God. But an idol is something that you make God. So political idolatry is when you make politics God. Simply and only that. Nothing more than that, nothing less than that. And I think when we have that as our working definition, we'll be able to start to look at these situations where people say, oh, political idolatry. And we'll be able to say, no, that's not political idolatry. Or, in the rare case, it's like, yeah, that is political idolatry, right? So that is important. I just want to ask a couple of questions. And I think the reason why I want to ask these questions about political idolatry is they're not really questions that are meant to be answered. They're just questions that are meant to get your brain moving. And this is kind of how I got to the point that I'm at with this term, when I just don't like it being used most of the time. I think it's not helpful most of the time. These two questions kind of got me to this point. Okay, so let me just ask this. First of all, why is it only most of the time that when the political right does things in politics that people accuse them of political idolatry? Why is it only when a conservative person most of the time does something in politics that they get accused of political idolatry? Or a conservative Christian doing something in politics? Why is it only then that people accuse them of political idolatry? Why is that? Okay, that doesn't seem right. Something seems off with that. You see where I'm getting at. Why don't we accuse, I guess this is just part of the first question, why don't we accuse people from the left when they do the same stuff of political idolatry? Okay, and I think that just goes to show you, okay, either, now I'll tell you where I come down on this, but either the political right has a severe idolatry problem, which I think is not true, right? Because now we just go back to our definition of an idol. What is an idol? When you make something God. Are there people who probably have made Trump God? Yes, but there's probably 4 of them in the United States. Okay, you know what I mean? And of course, then maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. There's not a lot of people, is my point. Okay, but either that's the problem. So either the right has a severe idolatry problem, which I don't think that they do. When you are comparing them to the left, right? I don't think the left doesn't have idols and then the right has idols. I don't think that at all. Or there's a double standard. And I would think that in 99% of the cases, the latter is true. There is a double standard, okay? And so this is just one way that I started tracking towards the conclusion that the term political idolatry is often employed unfairly, right? It's often employed unfairly. It's like every time that Trump says, well, I think the Bible is a good thing. Why are there people that jump up and go political idolatry? That's not political idolatry. Is Trump making politics God? And is him saying, oh, the Bible is a good thing, and is that making politics God in that instance? No, he's not committing political idolatry in that instance. Okay, so that was the first kind of question that I asked. Here's another question: why does the political left oftentimes unabashedly do whatever they want in politics? But, and I think that's true. I mean, the political left has come up with so many just absolutely crazy things that they want to do in politics. And that's not just because I'm a conservative that I say that, okay? Because I've seen the right come up with crazy things too, and I've said that's a crazy thing. But not as often. It just doesn't happen as often, okay? And the comparison here to the right would be, why does the right constantly have to live under the shadow of fear of committing political idolatry? Okay, now if you just think that I'm making this observation because I'm a conservative, I'll give you an example. You may remember a while ago when Kamala Harris was running for president, she was invited to be the guest preacher at a church and preach a sermon. Okay. Now, why is it that, let's just put it this way. What if the same thing happened, but it was Trump? What if Trump got invited to preach at a conservative church on a Sunday morning? I'm not saying this is a good idea, by the way. I don't think that Trump should be invited to preach at a church, but I don't think that Kamala Harris should be either. All right, let's get that out of the way. But I'm just asking you the question, what if Trump had been invited to preach at a church on a Sunday morning? The entire left would have stood up in unison and said, that's political idolatry. And you have to ask yourself the question as to why the right didn't stand up in unison with Kamala Harris and say, that's political idolatry. When the right can do the same thing that the left does, but then the right gets accused of political idolatry and the left doesn't. And specifically, Christians on the right who do things get accused of political idolatry. And then when Christians on the left do the same thing, they don't get accused of political idolatry. There's a double standard, okay? So really the only point that I want you to get from me asking those questions is simply that there is a double standard and that political idolatry is being employed unfairly most of the time, and that therefore we should probably step back and think about why we're employing that term and what is the goal of employing that term and what does political idolatry actually mean. All right. I've seen a good friend of the channel named William Wolf get accused of political idolatry a lot, but not in one instance have I seen him actually commit political idolatry that would fall within the biblical definition of political idolatry. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people who accuse him of political idolatry have committed political idolatry as it pertains to, what the Bible says about it. And that's one thing. That was one of the first instances where I was like, something's up with this. We can't just keep throwing this term around. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. Okay. Let's go back to the definition. Political idolatry, like I said, is when you make politics God. When you make politics God. I would argue that the most heinous examples of political idolatry are actually on the left. And they're supported oftentimes by Christians people who are supposed Christians who also vote Democrat. I don't know how you can reconcile those two things, but they try to. And I would argue that those most heinous examples of political idolatry actually happen on the left, not the right. A couple of examples. The government overstepping their bounds and acting as God. And what do I mean by that? Well, God has given the government a certain role. Romans 13 makes this very clear. Romans 13 says that the government is God's servant. If you look at the Greek word for that, it's God's deacon. Okay? If you think about how the church was supposed to appoint deacons, those people were servants. If you look at Acts chapter 6, that was the original office of deacon. They were servants. So the government is God's servant. So when the government stands up and says, no, God, I don't like what you have to say, I'm going to be the one that tells the Christians whether or not they can gather for church on Sunday. I'm going to be the one that decides what they can and can't say, not you. Well, now that's the government becoming God. That's political idolatry. And that happens more often on the left currently in our current state of things than it does on the right. You have also, like I said, the Kamala Harris thing. You also had many Christians on the left taking money from people to sway political elections in a very underhanded way, trying to get people in the church to vote a different way in a rather underhanded way, and taking money in order to do it. That's a real thing. There's a book called Shepherds for Sale from Megan Basham that talks about this and documents it, okay? So that's a real thing, and that is a lot worse than anything that conservative pastors have tried, okay? And so we have to ask ourselves, as it relates to the Christian in politics, or the way that a Christian thinks about politics, what is biblical? First of all, I want to point you to Psalm chapter 2, okay? Got my Bible here. I'm going to turn there, and I want you to see this. I want you to see this because this really is important. Psalm chapter 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Okay, so just a couple of observations here. We're looking at the kings of the earth. We're not just talking, this is not just directed to the kings of Israel or something like that. It's directed to the kings of the earth. Okay, so you can take that thought out of your mind. And then the second thing is when it says against the Lord and against his anointed, we're talking about Jesus there. Okay, and that will be clear as we continue. Verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Okay, you're starting to see the language that sounds like it's talking about Christ, because it is. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, here's the application. Here's the application. Therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son. What does that mean? That means do homage to the Son. Submit to the Son. Lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. I love that last verse. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. What a hope that we have. Those of us who run to him and take refuge in him. Okay, so that's great. But as far as how it pertains to our conversation today, the fact that the kings do not acknowledge that Jesus is the king does not exempt them from this command. Nowhere in this text are the kings exempt because of what they think. Okay, it's not like the kings say, well, I don't want this. I don't want to submit to Jesus. And then Jesus says, oh, it's okay. You don't want to, you don't have to. That's not how it works. They're commanded to submit to Christ nonetheless. And so, as it relates to politics and every sphere of life, presenting God as the one to whom people should submit and should run to for refuge is not wrong. That's not wrong. That's not a sin, and that's not political idolatry. So bringing God's word, which says that we must submit to him, which says that we must, repent and believe the gospel, into every sphere of life, including politics, that's not political idolatry, okay? So when, for example, when a Christian gets elected to a public office, we shouldn't say, that's political idolatry. You shouldn't be trying to influence politics, Christian. No, that's good because you actually have someone who has submitted, a king of the earth, you could say, who has submitted to Christ, okay? When someone who's a Christian ends up in Trump's cabinet, and if they're a good Christian, like a solid Christian, like a Bible-believing Christian ends up in Trump's cabinet, and they say things like, man, we gotta make the Bible more prominent in what we're doing and stuff like that. You shouldn't say that's political idolatry. What you should say is that's good because that person is now, that person's submitted to Christ. He's following Psalm 2. And maybe the good news will get to Trump as well. And that's the idea. That is what we should be doing as Christians, and we should not be afraid of political idolatry, of committing political idolatry when we're doing that, because we're simply following the Bible, okay? So political idolatry is, for the most part, a scary term with no weight behind it. It is effective at keeping Christians out of politics, but it should not be. It should not be most of the time, because most people that get accused of political idolatry are not actually doing it. Okay? They're not actually doing it. Should you be on the watch, on the lookout to not make politics God? Yes. But as Owen Strand said, he put out a little like a little booklet before the election last year. And he made this great point. He said, I'm going to paraphrase what he said. I don't have what he said right in front of me, but it stuck with me. So I'm probably going to get most of the words right because it's in there. It got ingrained in my head because it made a very big impact on me and on how I talk to people. You can make an idol out of politics, but a person should also be just as afraid of making an idol out of avoiding politics, making an idol out of avoiding political idolatry, of being third way in that sense as it relates to politics. Okay. Well, I hope that this was helpful. I hope that maybe this can take away some of the fear of getting involved in politics just because you're afraid of committing political idolatry. Yeah, you should be afraid of making politics God. But if you're bringing the Bible into every part of life, well, Jesus is king everywhere. So everywhere that Jesus reigns, his word has the right to go. Okay. And so I hope you remember that, and I hope that now you can go out and engage the public square for the glory of God, out of love for people, for good. All right? I hope you guys have a great week. God bless.